For the year, we start our church year from September, rooted and built up in Christ, from Colossians chapter 2, verse 6 to 7. We set the tone for what we believe that God would do in this year, that He will make us deeper rooted in Him. To be rooted in Christ means to deepen our connection with Him, just as a tree draws its life and stability, sending its roots down. This year, my prayer is that we will prioritize our time in prayer, study of the Word of God, and fellowship with one another. And we talked about the disciplines that help us deep-rooted a few weeks ago. Allowing Jesus' truth to anchor us in every season. When storms comes, not because of our strength, but because of the one in whom we trusted, we are rooted, we can stand. May this year be marked by deep spiritual growth and renewed passion for the gospel that God has entrusted to you. My prayer is that every one of us will see a deep-rooted growth in our life. Last Sunday, I gave the last message of the last year, talking about lessons that we learn from wilderness. And I shared the story of Israelites' journey, taking the passage from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 8. What did God do in the life of people during that 40 years of wilderness? 3 things I shared. For those who missed, I want to just give you that bullet points of 3 important aspects that we learned. Wilderness reveals our heart. God takes the opportunity to reveal our heart, how committed we are to Him through those wilderness experiences. Wilderness also demonstrates God's faithful provisions. Despite the fact that the wilderness was longer because of their disobedience and lack of trust in God, God never failed to provide. And that too, not just what is available, but what was God's heavenly provisions that people have never experienced. They experienced in the wilderness journey. And finally, we looked at what wilderness did to people, is that it was preparing people for receiving the promises of God. And I mentioned at the end of the service last week that I want to continue from another theme from the Old Testament, continuing a part 2, and some of you have come to listen to the part 2 of that message. And this is a message about people who are living in the promised land. What I keep noticing in the Old Testament when I read is that God is often telling the people to always remember the amazing work of God and mark it with stones inscribed, saying that when your children come and ask, what does this stone means? You need to teach them what God has done. So I've picked up 3 stories. What I share this evening is about memory stones. 3 stories from the Old Testament and what these memory stones means to us. And how would we create memory stones in our life? And what would that look like, and what would it mean for us? Memory stones serve as powerful symbols of remembrance and teaching and identity. Whether marking divine faithfulness or historical achievements or personal milestones, they call us to reflect, give thanks, and look forward with hope. Like physical anchors, they tether us to the lessons of the past while inspiring faith for the future. That's why memory stones are so important. We don't have those cultures anymore that where we carve a stone and inscribe and put it somewhere. But we do have some places when you go, you see stones inscribed with a word. I will talk about some of those today while I'm sharing what this means to us. The first story I want to share is from the book of Genesis chapter 28. That story is about a man named Jacob. That's the first place we see a memory stone is being raised. We have other stories of people building altar to God in worship, but this particular story is about Jacob. Now, you know, Jacob he lived up to the name that he had. His name literally meant deceiver, and he lived up to the expectation of that name all his life. He deceives his father, he deceives his brother, and he finally ran for his life, and not only for his life, but to find a wife. Okay, so he goes. He goes running because his dad said, okay, if you want to live your life, you get away from here because your brother is going to kill you if he finds you because you just deceived him and received all the blessing. So this is in Genesis chapter 28. You can go back and read the whole story. And as David runs from the place where they're living somewhere called Hebron in southern part of south of Jerusalem, and he runs all the way up to today's Syria, somewhere in a place called Padanaram, where his uncle lived. So as he's going, he came to a place called Luz, L-U-Z in English, and he comes to that place, and because the sun had set, he couldn't run anywhere, and he couldn't find a place, so he is in the open air, and he decided to sleep, and keeping a stone as a pillow. And as he sleeps there that night, he had an amazing experience of meeting with God. In the night, as he's sleeping, he sees a dream. In the dream, he saw a ladder that reaches from earth to heaven, and angels are ascending and descending on that. Now, as he's watching, he hears God speaks. So I named this stone as stone of God's presence. This is Jacob and the stone of Bethel, and you will see that what Bethel means. I'll tell you in a minute what happened. So I'm going to read a few passages, and I'll have some in the slide, but let me start from here. Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above the threshold, the Lord stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will be watching over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. And then he says this. When Jacob awoke from the sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gateway to heaven. Early in the morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on it. He called that place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. Bethel literally means the house of God. And in this stone that he puts up there, we can see what Jacob is doing is that Jacob had this unusual encounter despite the fact that he's running away from after doing all the bad things. He was cheating his dad, he was cheating his brother, and he's running for his life. But God decided to meet unusually to this place in a very ordinary place. This stone is a stone of God's presence. God's presence is found in that ordinary place. And God kept the promise that he promised to his father Isaac and Jacob. It's very interesting that it was not because of Jacob being a nice guy, God decided to repeat the promise that God gave. It is because of his faithfulness. The faithfulness of God was not dependent on the perfection of Jacob, nor it will be for us. God, despite our failures, God comes to us and reminds us that I will be faithful to you. And this is that moment for Jacob in the place of Bethel. Jacob wasn't aware of God's presence when he actually stood there. And when you read the story, you actually see angels are ascending and descending. And what it means is that angels are already there. God's presence was already there. It was just that he wasn't aware. Now, I want you to think about this. In your life and in my life, there will be times that we are not aware that God is actually at work. God continues to work in and through our life, even when we are not aware about it. And sometimes God shows up and surprises us. And this is what the surprising moment for Jacob, that God just shows up and he says, I want to tell you that I'm going to be faithful to you. The memory stone of God's presence help us to remind ourselves that God can meet with you any place, any ordinary place. Even when you are not expecting, God can show up. Memory stone of God's presence tell us that God will remain faithful to his promise despite our imperfections. It doesn't mean that we have to live an imperfect life. What I mean is this: God's promises in your life is not dependent on your perfection. God's promises on your life is dependent on his faithfulness. And that is what this stone reminds us. What is in your life that you can remember that God showed up in the last year, maybe last few years? When you look back, do you have moments that you see unusual presence of God? Oh, that was a God moment in my life. Any of you have those experiences? You can say that was actually a God moment. I remember a few years ago, in fact, it was about close to 20 years ago. My wife and I were preparing to come to China several years ago. And as we were preparing, we had a lean patch of time where we were not able to hear from God. And we kept praying that, God, we want to hear you speak so clearly. To the point where my wife got so frustrated, and sometimes she would come and say, I can't hear God speak to me. And if God doesn't speak to us, we can't do anything about it. We can just pray, right? So we decided to pray. There was a fasting and prayer in one of the churches that we were part of that was going on in the city that we lived. It was a long days of fasting, seasons of fasting prayer. And in those fasting prayer, because these churches are very large churches with 4,000, 5,000 people, they would come and spend that time in a large tent and will stay there for days for fasting and praying and asking God for God's voice to be heard. And one of those evenings, my wife comes from the work and sit at the back of those chairs. There was about 3,500 people sitting in that big tent. And we were sitting at almost the last row. That means we have 70 to 80 rows in front of us, people sitting, and we have large screens to show the preacher speaking. And as my wife came back and sat at the back with me, and our little son Hudson at that time was less than a year old. And we were sitting at the back, and she started just whispering to the Lord. Even I couldn't hear, I was just sitting to next. And said, I want to ask you, Daddy, that whether you love me or not. I've been praying that just show up. She just whispered in her heart, Father, do you really love me? And as she finished that sentence, we have seen this pastor, the pastor who was preaching was actually a guest speaker from the city of Accra in Ghana, came to India to preach. And he left from the podium speaking, holding his mic in his hand, come running about 70 to 80 chairs back, running to the back, and comes and lays his hands on Sajida and tells this, "What did you just ask? Do you love me? I want to tell you, Daddy loves you." She was shocked to death at that point. Almost she fainted. And I still remember that day. I was holding this little son in my hand and sitting next to her and not knowing what was just happened. You can imagine some 3,000-4,000 people sitting there. And that moment when God shows up unusually to tell you something, even a sentence to tell you that I love you, my child, that becomes a milestone in your life. 20 years later, I can imagine how many times my wife has told this story to people, and it still becomes a memory stone in her life because it was unusual visitation of God. And some of you might think, I wish I had that moment. I don't know when your moment is. But I can tell you, sometimes God shows up in unusual moments to remind you his faithfulness to you. And this was Jacob's moment. And you will cherish it until you have your memory working in your life, because you know those memories will not be faded. It will stay with you forever. Even in times of difficulties and challenges, when you start doubting God's presence in your life, you can look back and say, I know he speaks. And this is that story. And Jacob looks at the stone in the morning and he says, the only response I can have is to worship him. He takes the stone, makes it a pillar, and he called it Bethel, and he worshiped God at that place. I want you to think about those moments when God shows up or showed up. Remember those incidents in your life because they will serve as a reminder of God's faithfulness in your life. The second story is taken from the book of Joshua. It's a stone of God's provision. This is fast forward 400 years later. The people of Israel is now came out of Egypt, and God took them through the wilderness, which we talked about last week. And they finally arrived at Jordan, and God did a miraculous way, dividing the waters of Jordan. And the people came into this first city called Gilgal. Now, as they came out of that place, from Jordan to this place, God tells something beautiful to Joshua. Let me read that. On the 10th day of the first month of the people went up from Jordan and camped at Gilgal on the eastern border of Jericho. And Joshua set up at Gilgal the 12 stones they had taken out of Jordan. He said to the Israelites, in the future, when your descendants ask their parents, what do these stones mean? Tell them, Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground, for the Lord your God dried up Jordan before you until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan what he had done to the Red Sea when he dried it up before us until we crossed over. He did this so that the people of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God. As people were standing, the priests who were carrying the Ark of the Covenant, that going in front of the crowd, almost over 2 million people had to cross the Jordan. And this priest stood at a place right there in the middle of Jordan. God said, when you finish crossing, go back to that place, send 12 people, pick up stones, from where their feet stood, the priest were standing, take 12 stones and bring it, because those stones are going to be very precious for your life. For the rest of your generations to come, they need to know that God did miraculous provisions for his people. So these stones are God's provision, stones of God's provision. God fulfilled his promise. The stone in Bethel was a reminder of God's promise to Abraham. But stone in Gilgal is a reminder of the fulfillment of God's promise. There is about 400 years between the two. The journey through the wilderness was not an easy one. They wanted to go back despite seeing God's power in display. In the journey, they lost their main leader, Moses and Aaron. They faced many challenges and threats. They didn't know how to cross Jordan, but the Lord had intervened. The priest carrying the ark touched the water, and Jordan split into two. And Joshua did what God commanded. Bring these stones and keep it in a place where people can see, so that they can see the display of God's supernatural provisions. It is not only for a reminder for you, but it is also a reminder for the future generation, the generations to come. Tell them this stone means something to us. This stone is a stone of God's amazing provisions. If you go to Massachusetts, the city called Plymouth, there's a rock that's called the Plymouth Rock. It's now covered under a canopy of granite building. And it's inscribed on that is the number 1620. About 400 years ago, when the separatist people were living under the persecution of religious persecution that happened in England, and they were taking the first ship Mayfair coming all the way to America and landing in this place, they believed that they stepped on that rock called the Plymouth Rock. And that stands as a memorial in the whole country. It's kept safe in a place to remind the people this is where we began. This is where our journey began. People want to inscribe the date to remind people for generations after generation. This is the beginning of our journey. We were in the city of Bangalore for some time, the seminary next to our place where we lived. At the entrance, a beautiful, fantastic place that is built over a period of 15, 20 years. There's a large stone at the gate, very large stone at the gate, just sitting there at the entrance. And the back of the stone is written these words: God's work done in God's way shall not lack God's supply. This is a famous word of the missionary Hudson Taylor, quoted by the founders of that seminary. It was a field of rubbles, but by the work of many people, they were able to change that into an amazing institution. That stone is God's amazing provision, is a reminder of amazing provisions of God. God shows up when things doesn't go well in our life with amazing provisions. And that's what the story of Joshua and the stone. I remember the story of 2008 when the financial crisis hit. Some of the people who are sitting here remember that stories. Very few people. We were part of this church at that time. I was a missions pastor here. That year we had a fantastic plan to bless many people in many other places. We had a great budget. We started off very well. But in the middle of 2008, a financial crisis hit. And all of a sudden, we had probably lost almost 150, 200 people leaving our church that year. We had great plans and budgets in place. We thought we want to do really well that year. But all of a sudden, hit the financial crisis. And we didn't know how we were going to end the year. We all started praying. We thought we will give an appeal to the church. We did. That we want more financial support from the church to do all that we want to do. because we had made commitments to many missions partners outside to support them. I remember when the board and pastors met together, we were talking about cutting the cost and seeing, God, whether if we don't get it, how are you going to meet all these needs? And so with a lot of reluctance, we said, we probably have to cut the cost. But we decided to pray. We decided to pray that, God, this is the plan that you put in our heart to do all these things this year. You do it in a miraculous way. As we prayed, and we met as a staff team on a Tuesday for our Tuesday staff meeting, and we prayed at staff meeting. I still remember this thing. On the Thursday, we got an email from somebody saying that they decided to bless us with a large amount of funds that year, despite all the financial crisis going on. That year, we gave more than every other year in the past because someone decided to bless amazingly. I've seen this happen many times, that God intervening by providing more than what we ask for when we trust Him. God is faithful to fulfill His promises. Yes, you may have a lean patch of wilderness before you, but God will never let you live in that condition. He will fulfill His promises. What are you going to do with those promises? What are you going to do with those memories? Let me go to the third story, and then we'll come to the conclusion of an application. The third story is the stones of God's miraculous intervention. Or most of the time it comes in the form of protection from God. The story is another 400 years later. As people of God are settled in the place, prophets and judges were ruling the land. It's a time of Samuel. There was an enemy called the Philistines. Philistines were fighting against the people of Israel, and they decided to come and attack God's people in the land. Most of the time that happened because the people of God were not obedient to God, breaking the covenant of God, and the enemy was actually a tool in the hands of God to bring people back to God. But in this situation, as the Philistines came to attack the people came to the prophet Samuel and said, Samuel, please pray for us. Pray that God will do a miraculous work in our lives. And Samuel decided to pray on behalf of the people. And this is what he says. While Samuel was sacrificing the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near, engaging Israel in battle. But that day, the Lord thundered with loud thunder against the Philistines and threw them into such panic that they were routed before the Israelites. The men of Israel rushed out of Mizpah and pursued Philistines, slaughtering them along the way to the point below Bethkar. Then Samuel took a stone and set it up between Mizpah and Shen. He named it Ebenezer, saying, thus far the Lord had helped us. This is the third stone of God's miraculous intervention in the life of God's people in the promised land. Stones of God's intervention. This story is a great reminder of God's intervention in the lives of God's people. As God renewed the promise with Jacob, God fulfilled the promise through Joshua, and people are living in the promised land. But that doesn't mean that everything was going smooth and nice. They still had to fight their own battles. Maybe it was because of the lack of trust or disobedience. Despite all that, they were going through battles. The battles were real, and they didn't know what to do. They decided to seek the face of God, and God intervened in the midst of those struggles. We can see three important things that we can see in the stones of God's intervention. Number one, God is our ultimate help. He is our Ebenezer. He is our ultimate help in the face of struggles and challenges. There are things that we think that we can do, but then we see without the hand of God, there is no victory. Second thing that we can see in this story of the stone of God's intervention is that God intervened in that situation that brings people into repentance. The first thing that people responded to Samuel after God intervened is that we have sinned against you, and we have seen God's hand in the situation. The people had turned away from God, but when God shows up, the people repented and said, we will serve him. And finally, it brings gratitude to the Lord and a trust for the future. Samuel takes this stone called Ebenezer and places in the middle of that ground in Mizpah and Shen. And he said, this stone is a reminder of God's faithfulness. It is also a reminder of trust in God for the future. Our journey as Christians are oftentimes is a battlefield. Our mind is really sometimes, the psychologists have done enough studies and researches and says that negative experiences have larger impact on our mind than positive experiences. You tend to remember negative things that happen to you than the positive things that are happening to you every day. That's why you need stones of remembrance. Because otherwise, if you don't have things to look back and remember, what happens when negative experience happen is that we completely forget about it and we start to fear and panic and reject God's work in our life. It is so easy to forget about God's presence and provisions and protection. In the face of negative experience and anxious situations, we can easily operate from fear instead of faith. As we come to the conclusion of this message, I want to ask you this question. What are some of the memory stones that you are picking up? Do you have stones of God's unusual presence in your life? Do you remember those stones that you can think and keep it and say, God, you have done it in the past and you will do it in the future? Do you have God's miraculous provisions? Do you remember those? Do you talk about it? Do you have moments of Bethel in your life? Or do you forget God's work in your life? When God shows up in his presence, with his peace, with the joy that only he can give you. When you go through the difficulties and challenges, do you remember them? Have you made any records of God's presence in your life? Do you remember God's miraculous provisions in your life? Whether it's physical, financial, physical healing, emotional or spiritual healing. It may be for your children. It may be for your family members. Do you remember those interventions of God? How are you going to do this as you go? I have told my family that we're going to keep journals of gratitude. This is my gratitude journal. I want to write personal life stories about what God does in my own life. Put a date on it. Go back and remind myself, this is what God did. Read it back. There are times that my wife and I spend time at the end of the year, the last couple of days of the year, every year, we talk about what happened this year. What are those things that God showed up? We turn to the pages of what we've written and look at it and say, God did this. We want to talk about that to our children and say, God, you showed up in times when we need it. The second thing that you can do is a gratitude jar. Just a simple bottle. This is for our family's gratitude jar. We want to keep it as a precious memory. And we want to write down, I was talking to my children the other day when I was preparing for this. What color would you like to choose? Write it on it. Write on it every day something that you're grateful to the Lord. Or the moments of God's presence in your life. God's interventions in your life. God's provisions in your life. Write it down. Don't forget them. Put it in the jar. We will go through that at the end of the year. We'll take a time to thank God. This year, on the last day of the year, we had a couple of families gathered together, sitting together and talking about it. What did God do this year in our life? Because we want to be grateful. Take a stock of your life. Talk about that to your children. We live in a time where children, when they grow up, they live like they are entitled for everything. And because of that, they don't have gratitude towards God, towards anything that they receive. But we as parents, we need to teach them, as young as they are. Teach them about gratitude. I want to challenge you, friends, this afternoon, that when you go back home, spend some time thinking about what are those memory stones that you want to carry in the new year. Remember to write down them. Celebrate God's victories in your life. God's provisions in your life. God's protection in your life. Pass it on to the generations to come. As the worship team comes back and we stand up and sing this song, I want you to think about this moment. What are some of the memory stones that you would like to place? It can be an inscription, a stone that you want to write God's provisions and put it in your personal space and say, God, I want to be reminded of your faithfulness. Do not forget them as you live your life in this journey. God bless you.